I always knew I was different, especially from the other kids. I spent most of my childhood feeling like an outsider looking in. In school, I was either hyper focused on a topic or completely disinterested. I struggled socially and I didn't usually get what others said or thought. In groups, I never knew when it was my turn to talk, and I took a lot of verbal, and sometimes worse, abuse for being different. It would be many years before I learned that millions of people were similarly different. By adulthood, I would eventually catch up to my peers in most ways and find acceptance from a small group of close friends and, soon enough, a loving wife and family. I was still different, but by then we all figured I was just Dave, and being Dave simply meant that I had some idiosyncrasies and needed a few accommodations. I needed order and routine, and I got flustered by inconvenient changes. Sarcasm was very hard for me. I took everything literally and often personally. I truly only had two interests: cars and computers. I had to cut these scratchy tags from my shirts and shower right after haircuts. I was uncomfortable with hugging people, especially new people. I was never sure when it was my turn to talk, and when it was, I never knew quite where to look when talking to people. Now, I was great with stressful situations that I had the skill to solve, but terrible with things outside of my control. Despite taking 7 years off and on to finish high school, I did very well in university where I could focus on subjects that I was good at. By the end, I was clever, persistent, and fortunate enough to make it from Saskatchewan to Microsoft, starting as a software engineer on MS-DOS in the early 90s. After my stint in MS-DOS, I moved to Windows, where I was privileged to work on several other memorable features. If you've ever used Task Manager, opened a zip file, played Pinball, formatted a disk, or used the Start menu, you're using some of my code to this very day. A few years ago, my old university invited me back to deliver a lecture on my life and career. By now, I was self-aware enough to make a few oblique references in the lecture to having some telling characteristics, such as, there may be a whole spectrum of reasons I am who I am, or I may not be on the spectrum, but you can see it from here, or I could be on the spectrum, but if I am, it's the non-visible part of the spectrum. Shortly thereafter, a trusted friend and mentor, the very person who had actually hired me at Microsoft, happened to see the lecture. Now, his adult daughter had been recently diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, and that had sent him on a journey of self-education on all matters related to autism. He knew me well enough that he began to wonder if I had ASD as well. And after seeing me refer to the autism spectrum in the lecture, he reached out and took me for lunch, where he explained his reasoning. He followed up with the kind of email that really makes you sit up and pay attention. Maybe you should get yourself tested. Taking his suggestion to heart, I contacted the Autism Center at the University of Washington, which in turn referred me to a top local neurologist who specializes in neurodevelopmental conditions. There would be no rubber stamp. I learned it would involve 12 hours of intensive testing over several days. IQ tests, coordination assessments, personality inventories, the works. As I told friends of the upcoming testing, I had been expecting to hear a chorus of, "What? You autistic? That's silly." Instead, and to my substantial surprise, I was met mostly with knowing looks accompanied by comments such as, "Fascinating. Let us know what you find out." Now, in the meantime, I did what I did most afternoons. I stopped by a local auto machine shop to have coffee with Jim, a close friend who owned the place. He was about 70 now, a Vietnam combat veteran and a lifelong resident of my small town. He was also an absolute genius when it came to any car made before 1975. Jim had lost an eye to cancer just a few months back. Now, it was a melanoma that he ultimately would not survive. He didn't warn me, and one day I just walked in to find him terminally ill and missing an eye. As with many highly emotional moments, I was stoic and measured in the moment, until I had a meltdown that night. But on this day, when I told him I was being tested to see if I was a little bit autistic, he looked up from the carburetor he was working on, gave me a wry smile, and said, "Just a little, huh?" I guess sometimes you really are the last to know. I undertook the 12 hours of testing and then awaited the results. When the day finally came a few weeks later, I asked my wife to accompany me to get the rest of the results, and as the doctor led us through the paper copy of the report, we eventually reached the section on social interactions. My wife spoke up. "Well, at least the numbers are good here, far above average." But then the doctor quickly corrected her. No, higher is worse." And so the big news finally came at last. I have autism spectrum disorder, and not just a little. Now, it's a journey that's brought me face to face with some of the most challenging and rewarding moments in my life. As I navigated the complexities of my career and personal life, I discovered more about myself and the millions of others who share these unique traits. This glimpse into my experiences and realizations is just a small preview of what you'll find in my new book, The Nonvisible Part of the Autism Spectrum. Now, if you found my story intriguing, or if you think someone in your life might benefit from understanding more about living with some of the characteristics of autism, I encourage you to check out the book on Amazon. You can even download a free sample to get a sense of what's inside. It's available in paperback, and the ebook is on sale for under $10. But now then, can you be a little bit autistic? Well, that in turn depends on what we mean by autism and autistic. If the word autism is just shorthand for ASD, autism spectrum disorder, then I would argue that you either meet the clinical definition for autism spectrum disorder or you do not, in the sense that you can't have ASD without the disorder part. You can't be a little bit pregnant, and thus you can't be a little bit ASD. It's not just a cluster of symptoms. It must rise to the level of a specific diagnosed disorder before being ASD. If, however, we accept the word autism to simply mean the neurodevelopmental condition itself rather than the formal disorder, then it stands to reason that you could have just a little bit of whatever autism characteristics impact you, yet they may not rise to the level of an actual disorder. And so I believe that you certainly can, and many people absolutely do, have some set of symptoms or characteristics of autism that wind up placing them in this region, the area that I call the non-visible part of the spectrum. They will likely never be diagnosed with ASD, but they experience some of the characteristics and symptoms typically associated with autism. And I wrote this book for those folks. So if you or someone you know might be on the spectrum, please check it out. Thanks for joining me out here in the shop today. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage.